If climate change continues, as the IPCC has projected, hundreds of millions of poor men and women and vulnerable children will suffer. Viewed in this light, strong action now to rein in climate change is not the net cost that it's so often made out to be. Sure, it will have upfront costs, but so does any investment. Responding inadequately to the threat of climate change, on the other hand, virtually guarantees that our economy and our society will take a far larger hit in the future from the consequences of climate change and the conflicts it's likely to unleash. So we can summarise our situation in 4 points. First, we're currently on a totally unsustainable path that will have horrific repercussions for both poor and rich countries if it's allowed to continue. In other words, we're facing a global emergency, the likes of which we've never seen. Second, we need to restrict warming as much as possible, and 2 degrees is generally acknowledged as a threshold we shouldn't cross. So any proposed targets by our governments should be judged primarily by the temperatures they imply and the consequences of those temperatures if other countries to adopt similar targets. Third, massive reductions in emissions are required to achieve this goal, including substantial absolute reductions from rich countries and for poor countries, significant reductions below what their business as usual path would have been. But fourth, and let's not forget this, there are grounds for hope. The IPCC's long-range projections are projections of what's likely to happen if trends continue as they currently are. They are not predictions of what will happen. We don't have to choose that future. We can choose a different future. There is still time. Not much, but we have a window. We have a window of opportunity, a window of hope, a window through which we can imagine a different future. We must not give in to despair and cynicism. That's the easy and the lazy option. The situation is too dire for despair. We must choose to hope, because while we hope, we look for solutions, and the solutions are there. We can choose a different future, different from these doom and gloom scenarios. So how should Australia respond to this diabolical predicament? What should we do to ensure that the window of hope remains open? What questions should we start with? Should we start with the questions of what can the economy cope with? What will cause us least inconvenience? Or should we start instead with the question of what is needed to avoid disaster and how can we make it happen? We should consider, I think, the timidity with which mitigation measures are being discussed today to deal with a planetary emergency compared with the rapid general mobilisation a previous generation undertook to defeat fascism during the Second World War. Earlier generations understood that the national interest could not be defined as getting the best short-term deal for Australia. Earlier generations understood that the national interest was affected by events overseas. That earlier generation understood the fragility of freedom. Thankfully, they could read the writing on the wall. Thankfully, they recognised the scale of the threat and they mobilised against it. We owe our freedom to a previous generation who sacrificed their very lives to ensure that we didn't have to grow up under fascist dictatorships. What will our children and our grandchildren think of our generation if we respond to this emergency by trying to ensure that we're not inconvenienced, by trying to ensure that we don't have to make any sacrifices, and as a result, leave our children and grandchildren with a legacy of dust and ashes? Our generation faces a stark choice: to keep our heads in the sand, hoping for the best, or to recognise the scale of the threat facing us and to mobilise against it. Perhaps climate change will require that we make some sacrifices and will require we make some major investments, just like the previous generation made when facing another dire threat. To meet this challenge, we should not be thinking merely in terms of tinkering around the edges of economic policy, but rather calling for another general mobilisation. The economics of wartime are different from the business-as-usual economics of peacetime. Better market signals are of course needed, but they're not enough by themselves. A general mobilisation requires governments to take the threat seriously, to show leadership in communicating what needs to be done, and to make tough decisions about how to achieve it. In February 2008, the uber capitalist consulting firm McKinsey & Company, not exactly a hippie drum circle, released a report entitled An Australian Cost Curve for Greenhouse Gas Reduction, showing that Australia could achieve 30% reductions in its greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels by 2020 and 60% below 1990 levels by 2030 without any significant lifestyle changes, technological breakthroughs or massive investments in public transport. More recently, Greenpeace's Energy Revolution report showed that emissions from Australia's energy systems could be reduced by 37% by 2020. What would be possible if we took the climate change emergency and the dire threat it poses to the world's poor seriously and demanded a general mobilisation? What if we did make some sacrifices? What if we did undertake massive investments in public transport before the rest of the world catches on and the prices for buses, trains and engineers go through the roof? What if we invested hugely in solar, geothermal and wind generation, positioning Australian industries to surf the wave of global refitting in the 20s and 30s? Could we achieve 40% reductions in our emissions by 2020? Perhaps. Do we have any excuse that we could explain to our grandchildren why we shouldn't try? So to those beating the drum of Australia's national interest, indulging in the reckless radicalism of pressing for delayed action and weak targets, I would ask, how is it in Australia's national interest to lose more than 90% of the agriculture of the Murray-Darling Basin? How is it in our national interest to lose the wondrous wetlands of Kakadu? How is it in our national interest to lose hundreds of kilometres of our golden beaches to rising seas? How is it in our national interest to see rural communities in southern Australia decimated by near-permanent droughts? How is it in our national interest to idly permit the destruction of that glittering jewel in the crown of the world's natural heritage, the Great Barrier Reef? How indeed is it in our national interest to even contemplate the geopolitical disaster of 1 billion people short of water and hundreds of millions short of food and displaced by rising seas? Do we imagine for a moment that Australia would not be affected by that global upheaval? Across the world, our homes are already on fire. Flames are flickering at the treasures that we had planned to pass on to our children. And yet still some stamp their feet and say, we are not going to hose down our house until the neighbours have hosed down theirs. Is it just me, or is it madness to allow Australia's fate to be determined by the whims of foreign powers? Because that's what they're saying, isn't it? We will allow China and India to determine when we take action on our emissions. Let me conclude by just asking, what kind of leaders do we need? We need leaders who can read the writing on the wall, leaders who appreciate the scale of the threat we are facing from climate change, leaders who understand that Australia's national interests are not well served by international upheaval. We need leaders who understand that the global transformation to more low-carbon economies presents enormous opportunities for Australia if we are ahead of the pack. We need leaders who see this global emergency as the greatest challenge of our generation, not as an opportunity to score cheap political points. We do not need leaders who underestimate the Australian people, who pander to our natural predispositions to focus on ourselves. We need leaders who can draw out the best in the Australian people, who can challenge us to see beyond our day-to-day concerns, leaders who are prepared to take the risk of leading. The agreement that's hammered out in Copenhagen next December will govern the critical period between 2013 and the 2020s, the period when global emissions must peak and start to decline. The next 17 months leading up to that conference in Copenhagen will therefore to a large extent determine Australia's future, the future of our agriculture, the future of our tourism, the future of our national security, indeed the future of our economies and societies. Our stance in these negotiations will determine the legacy we leave to our children and to millions of poor people. Australia has this one chance to play a pivotal role in world history. Australia can help break the logjam in the international negotiations. In his address in Bali, the Prime Minister spoke of wanting to position Australia as a bridge between developed and developing countries. We could be that bridge. We could help show the big developing countries that the rich countries are serious. We could have dropped strong, binding emissions targets and put some serious money on the table to help them both adapt to climate change and to reduce our own emissions. AusAid's role will be critical in this. It's not going to happen without leadership. We in the rich world caused this problem. It is we who have to move first. It is we who must move without delay. If we do, we can help break the logjam. We can keep open that window of hope. We can choose a secure, prosperous and sustainable future. Do we have leaders of that calibre? Do we have a nation, a generation prepared to rise to this great challenge? We did once, and we owe them our freedom. I'm quietly optimistic that once again we do have what it takes, but we'll find out soon enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett Parris.